this presentation and the corresponding slides are copyrighted by Robson Forensic and may not be distributed or otherwise used without authorization. Today's presentation is on tree roots and sidewalk heaving. Our speaker today is Christopher Larson. He is a board-certified master arborist and tree expert. I'm going to hand it on over to Chris. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can also email them to us at inquiries@robsonforensic.com. We'll try to get to those all at the end of the presentation. Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Christopher Larson. I'm a board certified master arborist and tree expert with Robson Forensic. I have over 25 years of professional experience in both the public and private sectors dealing with trees, and that covers the gamut of tree work from items like today's topic of tree roots and sidewalk heaving, to tree risk assessments, tree appraisals, tree pruning, tree removals, management, and consulting. And most of the case work that I do involving trees involves property damage, personal injury, or even death. And um, I've worked, I've grew up in Minnesota, and in almost every job I've had snow and ice management responsibilities. So I do commercial and municipal snow removal operation cases, um, in addition to tree cases. But today's topic, we're talking about trees and infrastructure conflicts, particularly with sidewalks and sidewalk heaving. So we might as well jump into what is sidewalk heaving. It's when it's when the root systems of trees they either displace or lift up the sidewalk over time. And this is an important issue because it can present a trip and fall hazard for pedestrians. It can be accessibility challenges for wheelchairs and mobility aids. And um, when you have an issue, like when we're talking about litigation here, when you have an issue like this, I don't know if everybody can see the laser pointer here circling around this heaved sidewalk where you have an uneven walking surface. That's why that's the most expensive item when it comes to trees and infrastructure conflict is the liability associated with a trip and fall on this. It's not replacing the sidewalk or the tree. It's actually the liability associated with this, and that's what we're gonna talk about that. But when you get into litigation with trees and sidewalk conflicts, you definitely need to know that, yeah, uh, this isn't an uncommon thing. Trees and sidewalk conflicts happen across the country. And as an arborist, there's like a full compendium of strategies on how to deal with these infrastructure conflicts. So the question comes up, well, why not just get rid of why not just get rid of the trees? But most communities want trees for the shade, for the environmental benefits that they provide. They're considered green infrastructure. So these strategies have emerged as to how to deal with trees in these infrastructure conflicts. And but yeah, as it gets into litigation, you got to know that yeah, this can trees can definitely heave sidewalks, and what mechanisms do they do that by? And we'll kind of start out by talking about that's some of these causes are species related. There's certain species of trees that are notorious for doing this type of damage and heaving sidewalks. And I have a list here of some trees, and this is some notorious ones for lifting sidewalks. It's not an exhaustive list by any means, but ashes, cottonwoods and poplars, elms, locusts, maples, southern magnolia, sweet gums, and willows. Those are species of trees that have been documented and known to be sidewalk heavers, especially when they're grown in close proximity to sidewalks. Um, and I'm going to explain this a little bit too. Um, This is a phone app that I use. A lot of arborists will use 3D scanners on their phones for uh, basically taking pictures for risk assessment reports on uh, the tree root flare comes into play a lot. So I'm gonna just to kind of explain what this is. Here's a 3D scan, and nice part about these is I can get accurate measurements, and this picture can rotate around in the 3D scan app mode, and I can get really good measurements. But to explain what the root flare and zone of rapid taper is, I took a picture of this is a white pine uh, tree root flare, uh, and it did the 3D scan. And so the trunk tissue on the trees, the tree trunk, like right in here, it's going to transition down into root tissue, and they're different tissues. So as that area, this would be the root collar, and then this whole area is considered the root flare or the zone of rapid taper. Um, and that's where the roots go from trunk wood into root wood, and they're known for um, having extra radial growth, and they're associated with the diameter breast height of the tree, which is important for it's like one of the main measurements arborists take, and it relates to this root flare, and that's the area that's going to be able to exert the most force on these sidewalks when lifting them up or displacing them. So those are kind of key areas, and just wanted to explain what the root flare is. It's this zone where the root goes from larger diameter out to a smaller diameter, and based on that diameter I was telling you from here to here at 54 inches, that's the diameter breast height, the measurement that arborists take. Based on that measurement, we're going to know how far out this root flare goes, and that's where we're going to know where our proximity is with the sidewalk. Um, so I just wanted to explain that before we get into um, sidewalk heaving and safety, the strategies that are used. I was mentioning that there's a whole compendium of strategies associated with trying to deal with these, and some of them are preventative, some of them are remedial, or sometimes both, but they're the three main types of strategies that emerge are a tree-based strategy, an infrastructure-based strategy, and a root zone-based strategy. And we'll talk about these a little bit more. I've got some pictures of these and some examples, but um, this particular uh, picture right here is just showing um, sidewalk shaving or sidewalk grinding, and typically that's like a temporary measure, and that's done when the heave is less than 1 inch, and you're trying to buy time until to get into another cycle or incorporate the repairs with other repairs that are going to be going on. But if those other repairs, like let's say it's during a reconstruct, or they might do design and do a curved sidewalk, or there might be a planting bed where you have curbing or sometimes even fencing around there. And we'll talk about that in some of the examples. Um, but when we're talking tree and root zone based strategies, it's I'm probably going to sound like a broken record when it comes down to proper tree species selection, because a lot of these sidewalk conflicts are related to large statured trees that have they have large root flares and they're in close proximity to sidewalks. So having the right tree and having enough room in between the sidewalk is huge. But then some of the other things that root shaving is where you're not necessarily cutting off an entire root, but that's where you're shaving it down just so they can make the repair and get a new sidewalk panel in there. Where root pruning, on the other hand, is where an entire root has come off, and this it's done pretty commonly, but it can't be done without like certain precautions, or if too large of a root is taken off, it could destabilize the tree, and there could be more issues than just heaving a sidewalk. Um, but root bridging, that's where you actually, it's more of a permanent type fix, and that's where you're building a, a sidewalk over the top of a root system. You're um, basically bridging over that without having any infrastructure conflicts. Where root barriers, that's where you're putting a barrier in to either kind of redirect and keep the root from coming in direct contact with the sidewalk infrastructure. But sometimes some of these root barriers will actually be impregnated with herbicides. And so if the root comes into contact, it won't grow, or the growth will be stunted because of the herbicide. But a lot of times it's to redirect it to a deeper level in the soil so that it can not directly press up against the sidewalk infrastructure. Some other um, strategies dealing with, infrastructure, the sidewalk design. And I mentioned in that previous picture, if you're in a reconstruction for a neighborhood, and a lot of times they'll do a complete redesign, and you might, instead of having a straight sidewalk, you might have a curved sidewalk, or if there's enough right of way, sometimes they'll just create more tree lawn with the sidewalk design. But another strategy would be, I was mentioning that temporary strategy where you're grinding down that heave, and typically that's when the heave is um, less than 1 inch, and you're trying to buy time. Um, but there's other cases where you could have um, the sidewalk panel where it's offset or heaved on one side, and to bring that back to level, you actually pump concrete underneath it, and that's called slab jacking. Um, the other Another strategy is to reinforce the concrete with either mesh fibers, rebar, um, and that will just uh, prevent cracking. It makes it a lot harder for the sidewalk to have issues and get heaved. Same with thicker slabs. That's where the slab, a typical concrete sidewalk, is going to be 4 inches thick, where sometimes they'll go with 6 inch thick sidewalks or even up to 10-inch thick sidewalks, where the thicker you go, the harder it is for um, that root system to displace or exert enough force to cause infrastructure damage. And one of these other strategies would be throwing foam underneath the actual panel, and that just gives as that root system enlarges, it'll press up into the foam, and it's less likely to heave the concrete infrastructure. Um, so bringing these pictures back up again, and just kind of wanted to go through a couple examples, and um, because these are things that are going to come up in litigation if this, for example, let's say we're in a neighborhood, and the sidewalk heave is less than 1 inch, and that neighborhood's going to be reconstructed in 3 years, um, rather than do a total sidewalk repair to deal with it. You might just uh, do sidewalk shaving to buy time and then replace it with the reconstruct. But we could also talk about um, in that same neighborhood, if you had let's say a 10-inch diameter bur oak, and its roots are already starting to come into contact with the sidewalk, and you got to do a reconstruct. The strategy might be to do some root pruning if there's smaller diameter roots coming into contact, to remove those roots from direct contact with the where the new sidewalk would be. Another example, you might, like in that area, you might put root barriers uh, to prevent it and redirect um, the roots from coming into contact with where you're going to have the new sidewalk. And you might even bump that out further, seeing that bur oak can be a large maturing species, and um, if there's enough right of way, you might not have a straight sidewalk. You might bump it out around that and have a curved one, or in some cases they just shift the entire sidewalk over or add additional sidewalk on the other side. And you can also get into another example would be where you have impervious surface such as sidewalk and the roadway on all sides, but you have large trees associated with these walkways. You might have a like a planting bed, and these planting beds are to accommodate this the root flare and root structure. And typically, those to keep a safe walkable surface, you're going to have curbing or fencing or something around that. Um, but those are some examples of trees and sidewalks and how different strategies are employed to manage those. And like an example of uh, when we get into, we got to know causation. Obviously, if you're looking at a sidewalk like this, where major heave over a 4-inch heave, that's clearly a um, dangerous conditions, but then you got to get to causation and notice. So in this example, this is um, this picture was taken in 2025, and it's approximately a 30-inch sycamore tree, and this is a large statured tree that has a large diameter at ground level, large root flare. It's known for um, infrastructure conflicts. It's known to be a shallow rooting species. It's satisfying a lot of the criteria that it would need to have an infrastructure conflict. And then you get into like, well, yeah, this can clearly cause it, but how long would it take? Just running some calculators on this with running through growth rate, the species of tree, the proximity. There's some simulations you can run through. This would have taken to heave it over 4 inches, would take approximately 13 years. But surprisingly, this heave, no, we're not out. A lot of times we do this type of analysis because we don't have photos. But if you go back, there were street view photos that went all the way back to uh, it's the heave actually started in 2007, and it actually heaved it to the extent that it was ever going to heave it, or mostly to the extent it was going to heave it. But that was over 18 years ago. 18 years ago, is when it started, but it pretty much has been heaved up like this for a while now, like going back through the street view photos. But we can run through different calculations, knowing the species of tree, the growth rate, the proximity of the tree to sidewalks, and come up with time frames. So you have a clearly dangerous condition, causation, and notice, but um, that kind of leads up to, well, who's responsible for the tree, and who's responsible for the sidewalk, and that can be straightforward if, like on a private property, the property owner owns the sidewalk and they own the tree. Um, pretty straightforward. But as you get into commercial business owners, homeowners associations, contractors, municipalities, and government entities, and how some of those overlap, like based on uh, city ordinance, on who's responsible for the tree, who owns the tree, like right of ways. Um, an example would be a tree could be owned by the property owner, but the sidewalk could be under an easement and maintained by the municipality, um, and it's within the right of way. So you get into a number of different situations, and that's where we can help kind of um, sort through who's responsible for these types of situations. Um, and like a homeowners association, a lot of times you have contractors involved with maintaining the trees and inspecting the trees and maintaining the sidewalks. And a lot of times those sidewalks might run through an area where there's no uh, ability to get like a Google Street View or some sort of photo to show time back. That's where we can, based on the proximity of the tree to the walk, we can kind of calculate through that. Um, but that's kind of what I wanted to present and open it up for questions at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That was super thorough. I'm like about ready to go and start replacing pieces of sidewalk myself now. So yeah, like I said before, that Q&A button is right at the bottom of the screen. Um, I think an interesting question to start off with is kind of the knock-on effects that could happen from some of these strategies. Like I remember in a previous webinar that you did on hazard tree investigations, where like down the line after some of these things that they do to the roots happen, then years later it weakens the tree and the tree can become a hazard tree. I know I'm not saying this as eloquently as you can, but are you seeing those types of things in your investigations too, where maybe something was done to help a sidewalk situation, but then, however many years down the line, now you have a tree that is weakened?
Yeah, some of that's a good question and really important. I was mentioning with some of the root pruning that has to be approached in the right manner because uh, root if too large of a root is taken off in that when we were talking about the root flare and structural root plate, that zone of rapid taper, um, those are areas that are completely avoided by arborists for they're like yeah, kind of like an there's they're off limits.
The
Because
no-fly zone.
once you cut off one of those, if it's too close, it can destabilize the tree. So that's where root pruning, and a lot of times it's done in that zone, even though it shouldn't be. Um, and that's where you get trees destabilized. And when I look at cases like that, it's uh, right away you can kind of tell sometimes from pictures that it was a structural root plate failure. The tree toppled at the roots, and uh, it happens a lot with construction projects. I've had quite a few cases that was a factor that came into play, having to look at did they compromise the structural root plate of the tree, and therefore it failed after that. So that's one common one. And root shaving can kind of get into that where that can introduce decay, can also weaken the tree. Uh, but yeah, I'd say root pruning is probably the biggest one when you're talking
Right.
about.
Um, we have a couple of questions here. One, for these cases, do you always need to physically inspect the tree, or can photos slash Google Maps potentially provide you the requisite information you would need to form an opinion?
Yeah, I would say it depends, but I would say a large number of them, if there's sufficient photos and yeah, street views, other measurements that have been taken of either the heave or the diameter of the tree, and there's other ways to obtain some of that too. But most of the time, if we needed to get measurements of the tree itself, either someone would have to do it or if it's just off of photos, it can be done through I'd probably have to go to the site and scan it, and then you can use if the tree is completely gone, then you can use previous photos of the tree and photogrammetry, and we have a tech services that can do a lot of that. Um, But yeah, it depends. But I'd say if sufficient photos exist and measurements exist, a lot of them I wouldn't necessarily need to go on site, but it's always preferable if you can, but in some cases it wouldn't need to.
Um, okay. So this one says today's presentation was obviously focused on sidewalk heaving, but I was wondering if you also have past experience with conflicts between tree roots and road surfaces, like where erosion near municipal roads has occurred.
Um, yeah, I mean that can, especially where there's uh pretty steep slopes and vegetation removal, and then the slope can destabilize. Um, especially like I had quite a bit of experience with that too because I was an environmental services superintendent, and was responsible for the forestry, but also surface water management. So a lot of the stuff associated with rains and slopes and erosion control practices would come into play. But yeah, there's that can definitely be a factor if vegetation's removed from a slope roadside edge, and then there's erosion and the power of water is pretty crazy when you get water sheeting off of a road and it can wash out areas, and if you don't have root systems of a tree there to hold that in place, yeah, you can have issues with that. Um,
So the long story short is, yes, if there was a case related to
yeah.
vegetation and erosion near a municipal roadway, you would at least have the conversation with the attorney about the case. Um, wow, we got a whole bunch of questions just pouring in here. So s- we love talking about notice, right? So what are some key factors? Oh, my motion detection lights are going off. Talking about key factors to help establish actual or even constructive notice that the heaving had been there long enough. We're talking about heaving and notice. How are we providing that?
Yeah, so like depending on how much the particular walkway is heaved and the species of tree with its growth rate and kind of known displacement rates, it's typically going to have to be a larger statured tree known to be with known shallow rooting and in that close proximity, and then yeah, it'd have to have a measurable um, heave. And then there's other factors that play into being able to support that it's not something else. So looking into other things that would be site specific. But that's the main thing. One of the I'd say, and research has shown that too. The main thing is a large statured tree in close proximity, and then there's a list of other like important factors that contribute to it. And there's tons of research on this. Um, but yeah, usually, yeah, if you're going to have a heave and it's in close proximity, so it would be within that structural root plate area. And I mentioned that can be obtained from measuring the tree's diameter at breast height, which is 54 inches above the grade. That relates to the structural root plate to how far that will go out. So that's kind of key. As you get farther out beyond that zone of taper, it's harder to predict growth rates and um, the roots beyond that don't exert as much force. So that kind of a long answer, but yeah, there's ways to get that through the tree species, knowing its growth rate and its stature and proximity.
Okay. Next one, this is probably gonna be our last question because we're running right up to 2:30 now. In discovery, are you looking for specific information about the tree that would help you, or is there any information pertaining to the sidewalk itself? So are you looking for information about the tree, or do you also want information about the sidewalk? Like maybe history of work that's been done, or I don't know.
Yeah, it can be both because I was mentioning that there's different um, sidewalk thicknesses that some are less like the thicker they are, the less likely they are to heave. But if there's good photos and like if it's a typical municipal sidewalk, I mean a lot of it's related to the tree and the proximity, but I would want to know some of those other things. What was it like some super built sidewalk, um, because that could play a role in what type, how close the tree would have to be. Because kind of another example is trees typically don't heave curbing because it's built sturdier than sidewalks. Not that they can't, but they typically grow along the curbing.
Mm,
Um, so looking at the sidewalk, um, w- the sidewalk how it was built and whether there are any other factors at play um, g- would definitely be important. But in discovery, yeah, the more information, the better about the tree. Whether there if there's a number of different pictures, especially so like one of the things is having pictures of that root flare. Just because there could be asymmetries that affect that as well too. And then the overall site is helpful because of the w wind prevailing wind direction can create some of those asymmetries in the root system.
interesting. Wow. You're just a fountain of information, aren't you? Um, well, I think we could all probably sit here and listen to Chris share his wisdom all day long, but sadly, we are at the end of our time. Thank you, Chris, again. Everyone, if you have other questions that you want to discuss, if you have a case that you want to discuss, our information is on the screen. Email us, submit a web inquiry, and we'll clear conflicts first before we open up kind of a more detailed discussion. And yeah, get in touch with us. And we hope we see you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for your attendance.
Bye.